Hello, and welcome to the Alabama Public Health Training Network. Thank you for joining us today for our program, Human Trafficking, the Nightmare Next Door. If you have a question about anything being discussed today, please call or email during our broadcast. The phone number and email address are on a screen now and will appear again later in the program. Also, the handouts, sign-in sheets, and evaluations are all available online. You will need to register for this program in order to access those materials. Continuing education credits have been approved for nurses and social workers for today's program. In order to receive credit for this training, you must watch the entire program, then complete and return the sign-in sheet and the evaluation. While content may continue to be relevant, CE credit will only be awarded for 1 year for nurses expiring on November 30th, 2019, and 2 years for social workers expiring November 30th, 2020. Hi, I'm Bill Kennedy, the State Social Work Director here at the Alabama Department of Public Health, and I'd like to welcome our presenters today who are both from Camille Place. Adam Morgan is the Executive Director, and Renee Carpenter is the Social Service Director, and also a familiar face with us here at ADPH. Welcome to both of y'all.
Thank you, Bill. I appreciate that, and it's so good to be back. I want to get started today talking about human trafficking. I'm going to scroll through. These are our objectives. I'm not going to read those to you. You're certainly capable of reading those. But I want to start by making a distinction between human smuggling and human trafficking. So many times, especially in the media, I hear the terms used interchangeably, and they really are two completely different things. Human smuggling is actually a crime against a national border. It's not a crime against a person. It involves the provision of a service. Usually it's transportation, but it also includes fraudulent documents like fake passports or fake identification. It's bringing an illegal alien into the United States, and also harboring of illegal aliens is included in the definition of human smuggling. Human smuggling is a voluntary act. It's something that a person pays a smuggler to take them illegally across a border. So typically, human smuggling is transportation based, but just remember that it's a crime against a national border. In contrast, human trafficking is a crime against a person. It's a crime that exploits men, women, and children, usually through force, fraud, or coercion. The two most common types of exploitation that we think about when we think of human trafficking is forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. Those are not the only types of human trafficking, and that's what I'm going to go over in just a few minutes. But where human smuggling is transportation-based, human trafficking is exploitation-based. So it is a crime against a person, not a border. And again, these include crimes like sex trafficking or labor trafficking. Unfortunately, human smuggling is often deadly. I think about 18 months ago, you may remember that there was a tractor-trailer rig in Texas, I think it was in San Antonio, where there were 9 men who died in the back of that tractor-trailer from heat. It was in the middle of the summer. It was extremely hot. And one man was able to escape and go into Walmart. It was actually found in a Walmart parking lot. The smuggler had taken the money from these individuals and then abandoned them in a parking lot in the Texas heat. And again, 9 of them died. A few of them were children. Fortunately, the children survived. But they were extremely dehydrated and exhausted from the heat. So it can be deadly. It can also quickly turn into a trafficking situation. So think about it. If you're coming into a country, it's not your country, you probably don't speak the language, you're not familiar with the surroundings, you're not here legally, so you don't have any documents. If someone begins to exploit you in some way, who do you go to for help? You can't go to the police, you can't go to ICE, so it's very easy for human smuggling to turn into human trafficking. But I just wanted to make that distinction because those are not interchangeable terms, although a lot of times we hear it used interchangeably. So what are the different types of trafficking? One that a lot of people are not quite as familiar with is human organ trafficking. We know that there are about 115,000 people who are on the waiting list for organs in the United States alone. and about 20 of those die each day because of the shortage of available organs. And we know that anytime there is a demand for a product, in this case human organs, there's also going to be someone who will supply to meet that demand, especially for a high price. A lot of times you can get kidneys on the black market, $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. So it's extremely lucrative. Now, I cannot find any, thankfully, any verifiable cases where this has happened in the United States. It is common, though, in other countries. United States, of course, all of the industrialized countries tend to take great effort to make sure that the bioethical standards are met, that there's no legal dilemmas to be that are resolved, actually, related to the organ procurement. That's not the case in some of the underdeveloped countries. For example, Iran is the only country in the world where you can actually sell your kidney. It's on the black market. Situations like that are what created what's known as transplant tours, where people from the wealthier countries will go to the poorer countries to obtain illegal organs. India was also a hot spot for this, and it was so bad that they actually outlawed the practice in 1994 with the Human Organ Transplantation Act, because there were so many people coming into that country to obtain organs on the black market. And their people were, of course, being exploited for that. Related to that, just in the last couple of years, China has come out and admitted that they have been using executed prisoners for their organs. And you can see what a slippery slope that can become when you're dealing with a country, or not just China, but other countries, where you have political prisoners, you have religious prisoners, and that they could be exploited, actually executed, in order to harvest their organs. So this is something that is going on. It's not something common in the United States. In fact, like I said, I couldn't find any verifiable case where it had happened, but it is happening in other places, and I just wanted you to be aware of that. Some of those are India, as I said, Pakistan, Philippines, Iraq, Egypt, Iran. You can still purchase an organ in Iran. You can sell your own kidney. Now, Iran has taken some steps to prevent this transportation tours or transplant tours, and by limiting the price. The government actually sets the price that you get paid for your kidney, and they don't allow transplants to foreigners. The kidneys have to be transplanted to the Iranian citizens. The organ exporting countries doesn't mean that they're actually shipping those organs out. That just means that this is the countries that people can go to get organs. The importing countries, and you can see the difference there, the exporting countries are the poorer countries. The importing countries, these are the buyers of these organs, are the wealthier countries, and the United States is one of those. Another type of human trafficking that we don't think of often is child soldiers. Now, UNICEF defines a child soldier as anyone who's under the age of 18 who's used in any type of an armed conflict. Now, they're not always used as combatants, although we've all seen pictures of the small children, 8, 9, 10 years old, some of them, with guns strapped to their chest, and the guns are as big as they are. They are trained as combatants. But these children are also used as messengers, human shields, suicide bombers. I know you've probably seen the situations where there are baby carriages that have bombs in them. That's another way that children are used. They're used as sex slaves for the men who are combatants. They're also used as mine sweeps. They're actually sent to walk out into an area known to have mines planted in it. They're considered more expendable than a trained soldier. So sadly, they're used for that purpose as well. So why are children easily used? Because they're trusting, they're vulnerable. They're easy to indoctrinate and easy to manipulate. And even though our country isn't one that tends to use child soldiers, not recently anyway, in centuries past we certainly have, But think about situations of street gangs, drug cartels. Who do they recruit? They recruit children for those same exact reasons. Now, some of the places where child soldiers are used would be Colombia, the DRC, Myanmar, Uganda, Afghanistan, and some of these are very, very young, 7, 8 years old. So it's very scary to think about children being used in such a manner. But that is considered a type of human trafficking.
If I could tag on to that. I think one thing we forget, a lot of times we start thinking of these militant groups are the ones using the child soldiers. But in a lot of cases, such as the countries listed on the slide, like Myanmar, it's the governments who are using these children. UNICEF has done a lot in reporting. Last year, they estimated around 300,000 children as child soldiers. Now, it's slowly getting better. In the past 10 years, they've rescued about 65,000. But it's both government entities and these private militant groups. So it's a lot of the things that UNICEF and along with the UN and stuff like that have really been looking into, and policies and laws to really break this up and rescue these children. But it really is all around, especially Middle East and Africa and stuff like that. That's their big thing. It's cheap
really
for
is.
them.
It is cheap, and a lot of times the families are compensated. So you take a family that's in extreme poverty, they may sell one of their children to become a soldier. It's sad, but it's true. Another type of human trafficking is child marriages. It's a formal or an informal union where at least one party is under the age of 18. Now, we've all heard about the horror stories of the 8, 9, 10-year-old child brides, and that's certainly happening in places like Chad, Bangladesh, Syria. There are a lot of countries that do have child brides, and it's a huge, huge issue. But if we think about it, every state in the United States allows child brides, or child marriages, I should say, because it's not just the females. But with parent consent, all 50 states allow children to be married. Now, most of the states have a lower limit on the age that they're allowed to get married. In Alabama, for example, that's 16. So 16, 17-year-olds can get married with parental consent. But 15, 14, 13, they cannot, even with parental consent. But there are about 14 states where there is no lower limit. And that's in our country. Now, it disproportionately affects girls across the nation, or across the country, the world. But it also disproportionately affects girls in our country as well. It's something that, let me go back. It's something where it's, at the very beginning, when I said it was formal and informal, there are several religious groups that are very isolated religious groups that practice, usually they practice polygamy, and they have what they call spiritual unions or spiritual marriages. And that's oftentimes where we see these young girls being married to middle-aged men, 11, 12, 13 years old. So it's not just a legal marriage, it can also be an informal union. Now, along that same lines, there's forced marriages. That's another type of human trafficking. And that's where one or both parties do not enter into the marriage willingly. Now, that's not to be confused with arranged marriages. That's completely different. In some cultures, marriages are arranged, but both parties have the option of saying, no, this isn't for me. That's not what I want to do. In a forced marriage, the person has no option. They have no choice but to be a part of that marriage. It's happening in Southeast Asia, Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa. It's also, again, it's practiced in some of these very restrictive or isolated religious communities in the United States. And it's not just children, but it's also adults. In some of these communities, whoever the religious leader is can say, okay, this woman is no longer married to this man, she's going to be married to this other man. And so they're forced into that type of union. So it does happen in the United States, Usually when we see it in the United States, though, it's generally practiced where a young woman is taken, usually without her knowledge. She doesn't know why she's being taken, but she's going on a visit to another country, and it's in that country where she is then forced into marriage. So one of the most common types of human trafficking that we hear about in the United States, and that is common in the United States, is forced labor, or what we sometimes call slave labor. Child labor I've also added into this, and debt bondage. Now this is common in South Asia, Nepal, India, particularly in New Delhi, Brazil, Peru, the Middle East, but it is also happening in the United States. So how does someone become involved in forced labor? Some countries or some cultures practiced inherited debt. So if your parent dies with a certain amount of debt, that debt gets transferred to the children, and the children are then involved in the slave labor in order to pay off that debt. There's also situations of indentured servitude, where someone maybe is coming into the country legally, perhaps on a work visa, and the expenses that are incurred to get them here are then charged back to that person, and they become an indentured servant to pay off that debt. Now, unfortunately, a lot of times there are fees that are added to that, and so it becomes a debt that they can never repay. And then it becomes a matter of forced labor. Oftentimes, they're here on a work visa, for example. Their documentation is taken from them. So they're in a country they're not familiar with. Usually they don't speak the language, and now they can't even prove that they're here legally. Who do they go to for help? If they go to police or to ICE, they're going to get deported. So it's a very risky situation for them, and a lot of times they don't know whether to stay with the monster they know or go to the monster they don't know. A lot of times they consider it safer to stay in that indentured servant type of situation. There are cases where violence, lies, kidnapping, all forms of coercion, that's used to also trap people into forced labor. Now, the types of work where we see forced labor is domestic servitude, farm workers, not migrant workers. That's a different class. The migrant workers choose to do that work. Farm workers who are in forced labor don't have that choice. It's not something that they choose to be a part of. Nail salons, unfortunately, are notorious for this. Restaurants, massage parlors, textiles, mining, it's huge in mining and manufacturing. We have all of that in the United States, and so it is something that is happening here. And then probably the most common type of human trafficking that we're all familiar with is sex trafficking. Sex trafficking, human trafficking, again, those are not interchangeable terms. Sex trafficking is a form of human trafficking. And it's through the use of force, fraud, or coercion to cause a commercial sex act to occur. Now, commercial sex act is not just what we often think of as prostitution. It could include pornography, any type of sexual performance, such as a live show or maybe a webcam. And it's in exchange for any item of value like money, drugs, clothing, shelter, food. You've probably heard the term survival sex. Our young people, our runaways, especially foster care youth who maybe are very vulnerable, if they're on the streets, they're 12, 13, 14 years old. They have no marketable skills. They have no means of supporting themselves. They oftentimes get caught up in commercial sex acts just in exchange for food, shelter, or clothing. So that's, when you hear the term survival sex, that's what that means. It occurs all over the world, and there are documented cases in all 50 states. It's something that is happening here on a regular basis. And in fact, Alabama has the sex trafficking superhighway for the United States that runs through our state. It's I-20 between Atlanta, Georgia, and Birmingham, Alabama. And there are more people who are trafficked on that little stretch of highway than in any of the other places in the country. So it's not just an East Coast, West Coast problem. A lot of people think that it is, or that it's just a big city problem. So when I say that they're trafficked along this superhighway, that's not just trafficked in Birmingham and then sold again in Atlanta. They're sold at all the rest stops, the truck stops, the hotels, all along the way. So it's a very common thing. Traffickers are very highly skilled at being predators. That's what they are. They can pick out the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of their victims, and then they try to meet those needs. And probably the group that is at the greatest risk of being trafficked are our foster care children, because they're not in foster care because they have the most wonderful home life. They're in foster care because their family of origin has been fractured probably multiple times. So that makes them extremely vulnerable to someone who's coming in and offering them what they're missing. If they're looking for a loving, stable relationship, then that trafficker knows how to present that and set it up and make it look like, and for a while he will actually provide that type of environment, situation for them. But pretty soon it's going to get turned back around, and at that point those kids are trapped. And again, I say foster care is very vulnerable. Our runaway, throwaway youth, extremely vulnerable. It's often said, and statistics bear this out, that when a child runs away, they are usually are approached, I guess I should say, to become trapped in sex trafficking within 48 hours of leaving home. It's something that happens very quickly. The teenagers are very young. For girls, it's usually somewhere between 12 and 14 when they enter into this environment. For boys who are runaways, it tends to be even younger. Statistics are showing 11 to 13 years old. So when you think about how young that is and how vulnerable these children are, we can kind of understand how they get trapped into a situation of survival sex. They have no other means of feeding themselves. So it becomes a horrible life, and oftentimes it's one that actually takes their life, either through suicide, homicide, drug overdoses. These are all common means for these young people to die. So these are a few of the different types of human trafficking. I mean, you can see it's not just labor, it's not just sex trafficking. There are other forms. But I'm going to pass this over to Adam now to talk about the global issue.
I'm going to go back just real quick on what Renee was talking about. We talk about teenagers and young children. You know, we've seen so much over the past few years of these young kids, the suicide rate going up so high. You see the vulnerability in these children. Even if they have a loving home, it's not always the foster care system like we talk about. But a lot of these times they come in, they don't feel the love they think they need, so these people easily are attracted to them. We see this a lot in the video games and the chat rooms. There was a case actually the past year in Alabama, I won't say where, but there was a kid who was playing either Minecraft or one of those games and talking on a chat room and became friends with a person. This person obtained the kid's address and was sending gifts, boys' underwear and stuff like this, and sending instructions on what to do. Thankfully, the mother intervened. But it's those type situations that hit so close to our home that it's such a reality that we have to become aware of because of the easy access these predators have to these children. So just to change gears, we've talked about what sex trafficking is. Let's go a little bit to more of the reality and the statistics of it. Globally, 20 to 40 million trafficking victims worldwide in 2016. You know, we've had slavery from biblical times of Pharaoh and moved on over into the civil rights, and we see all this, and we thought after all that slavery's over. However, there's more slaves in the world today than ever before. It's such a huge industry. 25 million estimated in forced labor and 8 million in debt bondage. It's a $150 billion a year industry. Most are in forced labor, such as agriculture, manufacturing, mining, as Renee talked about earlier. We have 25% of them are children. Now, the majority of them are women and girls, But the rise is there with boys. People are finding there's for some reason becoming more vulnerable to that situation. So we do see a rise in that. It's now the second largest criminal activity in the world, second only to drug trafficking. We see the rise so big in the 1980s, early 1990s. Congress decided we're going to fight the drug war. We're going to enact all these laws, and we're going to give all these high convictions and to really curt the drug trafficking trade. Well, what that did was opened up another door. So they come in to the so we say the United States, but globally UN has been on the same thing, and all these other governments in Europe and some in China have really pushed the drug trafficking laws a little higher. But in the U.S., we started all these laws to really put a high risk on the drug traffickers. They come in, and you see a minimum of 5 to 10 years on a drug trafficker that maybe have 100 grams of marijuana. They come in with a child, they may get 3 years. So you see it's a risk-reward situation, and they decided, these drug lords and some of the smaller entities, they say, okay, why do drugs when we can traffic women? If we get arrested, we get less time for it. And it's also it's a commodity to them they can sell over and over. A drug, you sell it once, it's done. You've lost your money after that. But a girl or a boy, they have, a lot of them, 10 to 20 times a day that they're selling these children. So they get more money, more profit, and if they get caught, they're out in 3 to 10 years maybe, and they can go back to it. Drugs, I mean, you see some conviction rates, they're putting them in prison for 10 to 20, 50 years. Why would you want to do that from a business standpoint? So that's one reason you see sex trafficking, human trafficking growing so tremendously right now. In the United States, based out of D.C., you have the Polaris Project. It's named for the North Star that guided the slaves to freedom in the U.S., and it works to eradicate human trafficking worldwide. There was 31,000 cases identified and responded to in the past 10 years. 80,000 of them individuals and organizations are trained based out of the Polaris Project. So they're really, not only are they kind of the foundation for this fight in the U.S., but because of them, other organizations have come out of them, Shared Hope International and other organizations that have gone globally to fight this, and they work alongside with the UN and UNICEF to really fight this worldwide. So it started here in the U.S. and slowly growing to eradicate trafficking around the world. On the screen you'll see the Polaris Project National Hotline, along with their Be Free text line for survivors and private citizens. We've had over 40,000 cases of human trafficking that have been reported to the Polaris Project in the last 10 years. Multiple reports each year. Just in Alabama, you'll see further on in the slides, we get calls almost every day and it may not be a case that follows through, but people are slowly becoming aware, so they're seeing something and they're saying something. The National Hotline receives an average of about 90 calls a day. Now remember, that's an average. You have some days they're going to receive closer to 200. Again, maybe not all those fall through. 20% of texting conversations on that Be Free text line are with survivors. So human trafficking in Alabama. For 2017, we had 184 calls and 68 cases reported. You can see the breakdown here, sex trafficking being the highest, but labor trafficking falling behind on 11, and sex and labor with 5. And then other calls could be marriage situations like we talked about, maybe a relative deciding to call in a case, something that they weren't all that happy with. And then we have set up fusion centers, Department of Homeland Security, and we have these in Alabama. You can see the phone line here. What they do is really try to put together a national database of all these criminals and victims. That way it's easier for local entities, local police departments to identify situations further along. They were developed after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, and they have been a vital part in law enforcement all throughout the U.S. I know my friends in the law enforcement utilize them, even in our small town where we're from. They utilize them when they come across a case that has come across county lines, and they can call and contact them and say, hey, let's really work together on this, see what's going on, and they can see the timeline because all these local entities are utilizing these fusion centers. They fuse the information and analysis for local and state federal agencies, as I said, and they provide information and education, and they're there as a resource for entities like us as Camille Place. They focus on threats such as major criminal activities, cyber attacks, drug ring, human trafficking, and human smuggling. And one thing before I end that, without going back to human trafficking in Alabama, one organization that I mentioned earlier, Shared Hope International, what they have started doing in the past 10 years has doing a report card for all the states based on the laws, convictions of human traffickers, organizations that are there, where the congressmen are going with their mindset on things, and surprisingly, a little bit to me, we started out at, I think, a C- back in the beginning, Alabama was, and we received our report this year, and we've moved 11 points in the past year to an A, or one of the highest growing in the United States on what we're doing here in Alabama. Our congressmen are working hard. Organizations such as Camille Place and others are working alongside them and working in the local communities to fight this. So I think it's exciting news that we're on the right track. We just got to keep going with it. So.
And how many states have an A rating? It's not that many.
No, I think it's less than 10.
Oh, wow.
So
okay. It's nice to be known for something positive,
exactly.
Right? Okay. So what are the signs of human trafficking? What are the things you need to look for if you think someone, or something that would be like a red flag to make you think that someone might be being trafficked? If a person is unable to leave or to come and go as they please, and this person is an adult, and we can understand with kids they can't always come and go as they please, or they should not, but for adults, if they're unable to really be an independent person, if they're unpaid or paid very little or paid only in tips, sometimes it's very common for someone who is being trafficked to live in the same place they work, and they never leave that building. Also, if they're working in the sex industry and they have a pimp or a manager, that's another red flag that they're being trafficked. Now, these are all just possibilities, something that would make you think that a person might be trafficked. However, the next one is one that is a guarantee, it is a definite, it meets the definition of sex trafficking, and that is anyone who is under 18 years of age and is working in the sex industry. That is a definite 100% that person is being trafficked. Now, we are very fortunate in Alabama that in 2016 there was the Safe Harbor law that was passed, which means that anyone who is under the age of 18 and is picked up for sex trafficking or for being in the commercial sex industry, they are not treated as a criminal, they're treated as a victim. Before that law passed, it was very common to have a 14 or a 15-year-old arrested for prostitution. As bizarre as that sounds, they're not even old enough to give consent for sex, and yet we're treating them as a criminal because they're being trafficked. So that was a wonderful thing that happened, and it opened up the doors for our victims to really get a lot of services, especially when they're not being treated in the juvenile justice system. Someone who works excessively long hours, they're rarely allowed breaks, rarely have vacation days. It's not uncommon to see someone working 12, 14, even 16-hour days, 7 days a week. That's a guaranteed example of someone who is being trafficked. They owe a large debt that they cannot pay off. Remember the indentured servitude or the debt bondage, that's what this may be. And also, if there's high security measures at the workplace, cameras inside the building, outside the building, bars on the windows, if there are no windows, that's another big red flag. That this is a workplace that is doing something very, very unethical, illegal, almost always going to be a labor trafficking situation. If the person has very few or no personal possessions, that's again something that you would look at and think, yeah, that's probably a trafficking situation. If they're fearful of law enforcement or just the mention of law enforcement, then oftentimes the traffickers will indoctrinate them with all of these horror stories about what law enforcement will do to them, that they'll be taken into the back room and repeatedly raped. They become very afraid of law enforcement. If they're not in control of their own identification documents. Now, we're talking about children who are first entering into sex trafficking, for example. If they're between 11 and 14 years old, they're probably not going to have any documents anyway. But if they're older than that and they're not in control of their own driver's license or their own Social Security card, or they're not in control of their passport, their work visa, they have no way of proving who they are and that they belong here. That's probably a trafficking situation. If they show signs of confinement, abuse, torture, we often look for like ligature marks on the wrists, the ankles, the neck. There's also cases of burning, being burnt, branded is another one. If there are particular types of tattoos that may be on the person, money bags is very common, dollar signs. And one that we are seeing a lot with sex trafficking is the barcode, just a simple barcode, and it may be in the lower lip or on the back of the neck. But that dehumanizes that person. It makes them appear to be nothing but a commodity. And to a trafficker, that's what they are. They're just a means to make money. And it's a way to further push down, I guess, that person and take away any power they may have. They often are not allowed to speak for themselves. That's not to say that using an interpreter means that they're being trafficked. That's not the same thing. Using an interpreter just is using someone who speaks both languages. That means the victim is also, or what I'm calling a victim, is also able to talk. What I'm talking about here with not being able to speak for themselves is having someone else who answers the questions for them. We see this a lot in domestic violence cases. It's also very, very common in human trafficking cases because the trafficker doesn't want anybody knowing that this person is being trafficked. If they avoid eye contact, that's another sign. A lot of people avoid eye contact, and that's just their nature. It's just who they are. But again, when you start looking at multiple signs, that's when you start seeing, okay, maybe there really is something going on here.
Going along with talking about the tattoos and stuff like that, one of the things that the fusion centers have started doing in the past few years that I talked about earlier, they take these tattoos and they put them in their database, and they have people in other agencies that are looking on all these websites such as Craigslist and Backpage. Now, a lot of that has been shut down, but they're able to put evidence together when they find a pimp. They know what his brand is. They're able to use that brand, connect it to all the cases that may have that branding in it, and use that against him in a conviction. So thankfully we are taking the steps, you know, what they feel as their plus, because they're pushing down on these women and making them feel like they're nothing. We're using that against them. So we are making strides in that area.
Good. Crowns would be another tattoo that we see a lot. Stars. Stars in clusters, I guess I should say, not just a star, but stars in clusters. We see that a lot. So those are usually signs of sex trafficking. If they're not in control of their own money, someone else, they earn money, someone else takes it from them. That's a sign. One that we see a lot with sex trafficking in particular is they may say that they're just visiting because they can't tell you where they live. Oftentimes they don't even know where they are. The Fusion Center tracks, again, they have incredible ways of finding these victims, but oftentimes they'll track them using their cell phones and the ads that come across Craigslist or whatever the other websites are. And they can follow this person, and the victim may be 3 hours in one location, and then they're moved to somewhere else. They may spend a few hours there, they're moved somewhere else. So they don't know what state they're in, they don't know what town they're in, they have no sense of that whatsoever. There's also that loss of time, that they're not really sure what time of day it may even be. And that's, again, because they're being worked on what's called a circuit. So they're taken from this city to that city, and they could be in 3 states in a 24-hour period. That's been documented. And they're sold at each place. That's one way that they can stay ahead of law enforcement, is if you only spend a few hours in one location, then it's very hard for law enforcement to be able to pick that up. So those are all signs. It's not definitive, but it's just something to be aware of and to look out for, something to make your ears perk up and say, you know, this could be something that is not a good thing at all, and it could be a trafficking case. So what do you do if you think that it may be a trafficking case? Well, these are some of the hotlines that you can call. ICE is one, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. That's their phone number. You can call and give them a tip for trafficking and also for smuggling. The Human Trafficking National Hotline is 888-373-7888. That's run by the Polaris Project. And an easier way to remember it is to say 888-3737-888. So that's a number that you can give someone if you are in a healthcare setting, for example, and someone you think may be trafficked. You can give them that number. They can call when they are in a safe place. Also, the Be Free text line, 233-733, is something that they can also text when they're in a safe place. Now, the difference is this is with adults. If you come across a case with a child, then we need to report it to DHR. DHR is the agency that handles those situations. But you can report it to every agency, not just DHR. But child cases do go to DHR or local law enforcement for sure. Also, cases for adults who may be incapacitated in some way. Maybe it's an intellectual disability, a physical disability, they're elderly. We do see cases of, a lot of cases of exploitation of our elderly. And those cases also need to be reported to DHR. Now, that's just in Alabama. If you're in another state, then you need to call the agency in your state that's responsible for Child Protective Services and Adult Protective Services. And they all have different names, but every state has a mandated agency for that. But these are some of the places you can report it to. And again, you can report it to local law enforcement as well.
If you travel, I truly suggest having these numbers in your phone, especially airports and hotels. You see it a lot coming through these hotels, or like sporting events. One of the biggest deals in the U.S. is when the Super Bowl happens. So you have all these people staying in these hotels. If only they're paying attention. We hope they are, and we can hopefully catch some of these cases. Here in Alabama, some of the biggest events like Talladega, it happens. The hotels there, the grounds, it happens. So it's reality. So it's important to have these numbers handy. Even if you think you may never see it, having it that one time could save a life.
And to me, one of the most shocking places in Alabama, where it's a hot spot, is the Dothan Peanut Festival.
Yeah.
Who would have thought that the Dothan Peanut Festival is a hot spot for human trafficking? But it is. It's close to I-10. Anywhere that you're near an interstate, you're probably in an area that can be where there's a lot of trafficking. So it's very scary to think of where all this is going on.
You know, annually they say it's anywhere from 300 to 600,000 trafficked in the United States. That's the population of Wyoming. Wyoming was 573,000 people the last census. 600,000 people trafficked in the U.S. annually. So statistically, it's going to be close to home. So that's why it's so important to be aware of the signs, and to be aware of what the numbers are that you can contact.
And to also be aware that it's not just women, it's not just girls. Boys and men are also victims. The ratio is about a 7-to-1 ratio of females to males, and that tends to be in the sex trafficking industry. We think, one of the reasons that boys are younger, or seem to be younger when they're entering into that industry, is so many of them seem to be thrown away or kicked out of their homes because of sexual identity issues. The LGBTQ community is extremely vulnerable to this type of situation. So just be aware of that, and report any of these if you have any doubts whatsoever, any questions about it. Get the information. Whatever you do, don't intervene yourself. Okay, this is a very dangerous situation. Let the professionals handle it. So I've also added the Resource Center. There's a chat room that you can go to with the Human Trafficking Hotline if you want to report it that way. And you can call the Fusion Center in Alabama. Every state has at least one Fusion Center. Some of your large metropolitan areas have more than one. So some of your cities, like Los Angeles, New York, some of your very large cities will have their own Fusion Center. And then there are multiples across different states. But Alabama has one, and it's housed here in Montgomery. And then I also have listed some resources if you want to look into this more, if you are interested in finding out what's going on. There's resources in your packet. So does anybody have any questions? That's what we have.
There are a couple of questions that have come in. The first one has to do with you're working in a clinic and or your office, and you have, you're seeing some signs that you think potentially could be human traffic. You've given the hotlines. What about locally? Who do you call locally to help with the situation?
Local law enforcement.
They're slowly being trained throughout the states, different organizations. There's a few here in Alabama that go to these local law enforcement agencies to train them. They go to these symposiums when they go to law enforcement training, and actually in Alabama, I want to say last year at the where you get certified to be a police officer, it was a small course in that. So it's slowly getting into that. So they should be hopefully trained to know how to mitigate that situation. Maybe just to talk you through and get what's going on and say, hey, is this actually human trafficking? And if so, let them take from there.
The FBI is another resource. You can also call the FBI.
Follow-up to that would be, what if the individual, the patient, is hesitant? You don't want to put them in danger. So, at what point do you push the phone call, or push or just provide them with the number and let them handle it?
It's tricky because nobody knows their situation better than they do. They know if they would be in danger. They know when it's the safest time for them to try to get out. So providing them with these numbers, with this information, is probably the safest way to do it. However, again, if it's a child or if it's one of those protected adults, then we've got to make a move then. Not necessarily with them sitting there in the office, because often their trafficker is going to be right outside the door, or possibly in the room with them. So if you're in a clinical setting or a hospital setting, that's ideal, because you can always separate them. It's very easy to separate them. If you're in a hospital, take them for an x-ray, allegedly. Nobody can go in that room, so it's very easy to separate them in that situation. But be aware, the last thing we want to do is to make their situation worse and have them beaten or killed when they leave your office. So it is a judgment call. But if it's a child, then make sure you get as much information as you can, report it to the Child Protective Services, local law enforcement, the FBI. If it's an adult, you can still do the same thing, but also provide the information to that individual.
Had another question. Says, I'm not real familiar with the Camille Place. Can you tell us more about the Camille Place?
I guess we should have started with that.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Adam.
So Camille Place is a nonprofit Christian home that was founded about 3 years ago, hopefully breaking ground first of the year, but we're the first of our kind in the U.S. We will house girls under the age of 11 up to 18.
So it's birth to 18.
Yes, birth to 18. And we'll have areas where, you know, these victims, some of them do come with children. So we're there and prepared for that. They'll get the care, the therapy, the schooling, anywhere from art classes to music classes. We're going to be there with them day in and day out, hoping they feel loved and protected and safe from the life that they used to live. So that's where we are. Like I said, hopefully breaking ground first of the year. Things happen, but we're shooting for it and we're working hard toward it. We also, as the group, our founder has been instrumental in a policy called, I think it's the No More Nudes Initiative. Nudes No More initiative that's being pushed to the public schools in Alabama. So we're trying to start on the front end to mitigate this situation, and we're going to be there for the back end of it too.
And that's to educate our kids on the dangers of sexting, sending nude pictures, the fact that no matter what happens, that picture never goes away. It's out there somewhere. And also educating the recipients of those pictures that they're in possession of child pornography. That's a crime. So they've got to be very careful about that. So it's really trying to make sure that we, like you said, we decrease that vulnerability of our young people across the state. It's one of the things that we're very, very big on. Also, we are a nonprofit, so if you're looking for a tax deduction for the end of the year, we'll be glad to take your money.
If you're watching live, today's Giving Tuesday, so we'll be glad to be that person for you.
Well, how would you get in contact with the Camille Place? Is there a phone number? Yeah. How do you make a referral? How would you make a donation?
So we do have a website, CamillePlace.com. We have you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, any kind of social media. We're there, and we answer as quick as we see it. So we're there. You can donate online on our website, CamillePlace.com. And I will just I know that's kind of an odd name, but we were named after a beautiful young girl in South Alabama, Camille Coates, who that was her passion, was fighting trafficking. And it had been founded, and it was a tragic accident, and she lost her life. And the founder decided what better way to honor her and her passion than to name this project after her. So that's why we are called Camille Place.
And she was a missionary in, I think it was Greece, which is a hot spot for trafficking. So that was something that she really wanted to do, but she was 24 when she passed away in a car accident. So Camille Place is named in her honor. I will say that if you're looking for an address, it's Post Office Box 1217, Monroeville, Alabama, 36461. But again, that's on our Facebook page. It's on our corporate website. So we're out there. You can find us. Now, we're not open, as he said. We have not opened our home. So we're not able to take referrals for that. We're doing all kinds of trainings, speaking engagements, stuff like that. So we're available for that.
And we'll be focused more on victims that are rescued here in Alabama as of right now. Of course, down the line, we have a lot of dreams, and hopefully we'll be able to succeed in that. But for now, we will focus on girls that are rescued here in Alabama.
And we will be doing, I'm going to put another plug in, we will be doing a 2-hour training that is specific to sex trafficking. And that will be on December 13th in this same location. So join us for that. Any other questions?
None at the moment.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. We do definitely want to thank the Department of Public Health and UAB and those who have made this possible. So thank you all for being here, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, thank you.
This concludes our program for today. I want to thank our presenters for being here and remind everyone that this program will be available on demand. Also, we will continue the human trafficking discussion with a more in-depth look in our Part 2 program on December 13th. Again, thank you for presenting, and those of you who are watching, thank you for watching with us today. Have a great day.